Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Jake Williams Show. I am, of course, your host, Jake Williams, and I'm going to be quite honest with you. You're probably sick of hearing about it, and you're probably sick of me talking about, not just me, but everybody talking about it. So I'm not going to spend the whole entire episode on this, but I feel the need to talk about it because, as I've mentioned before, this show for me is a therapy session with you, the listener, and I really need to talk about this and get this off my chest. I'm, of course, referring to the two shootings, again, in the United States. Of course, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, the most recent cities to have this kind of tragedy happen to them. And if you can tell my the tone of voice that I have, I'm not trying to come off sarcastic and be a jerk about this because this is a tragedy. Almost at this point, I think over 30 people combined have lost their lives to this nonsensical act of violence. I will not talk about the shooters. I will not refer them in name. I'm not going to do any of that. That is not what I'm doing. I'm going to go after two things I really want to talk about, and then I will move on from the subject. I don't know how long this is going to be, so I will easily going to put the timestamp in the episode. If you do not want to hear me talk about this, I totally understand it. I'm not going to force you to listen to this in any way. But I will say I think it's important to hear this side of the story, and I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations, even though we shouldn't. This shouldn't be an issue. This shouldn't be a conversation that we have to have at all. Any country should never have to have these discussions. And I know it's silly to think that tragedies don't just happen here. They happen everywhere on a daily basis. People die consistently. Thanks for reminding us that way, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who could not wait to flash his facts out there, throw his big brain numbers out there. Dude, read the room. You would think if somebody as smart as this guy would be able to understand this scenario and not put out a tweet that quick, being that cold and callous. Despite the fact that it may be right statistically and you might have a legitimate numbers there, it's still incredibly insensitive. But you know what the problem is? He's probably just so used to this stuff, and he's just so desensitized to this kind of garbage that he didn't even think about all these families that were affected by this. Can you blame him? As much as it happens here, it's almost forgiven at some point. What I wanted to touch on was something that, again, is just incredibly tone deaf by the President of the United States, who, again, never ceases to amaze me at how ignorant he can be for the person that's supposed to be leading our country, who has the most important job in the entire country. It amazes me that he continues to be this tone deaf. What's he do when he goes out to try and comfort our country and unite us again in this situation? He attacks video games. Video games. Like we're in the 1990s or the early 2000s, he attacks video games. Why not we look at the real scenario here, the real situation? We have mental illness that have to do with all of these shooters. That's the one connective tissue to every single shooter that we've had since Columbine. There's some sort of mental problem, with some sort of issue with their mental health, and we refuse to address it properly. And when we refuse to address it properly, they murder people on a giant grand stage for everybody to see, because then we have a media who's obsessed with blood and violence. I will say this, the things that Trump said, he was kind of spot on with that. We do glorify violence in this country, but it's not video games who glorifies the violence. It's our media. It's everybody. It's not just video games. It reaches everybody. Okay? But to blame them for any of this stuff is asinine. There's no one to blame for these decisions and these choices but the people that did it. Or maybe, just maybe, it's been the gross rhetoric from the president himself. But no, it's video games. Because I'm an old geezer. I don't know what video games are. I don't know how this works. It's got to be video games. Despite all these signs that it was most likely mental health. It's multiple layers. It's not just, God, even though study after study after study has proven that there is no correlation between the two. I've been playing a lot of Halo and Gears lately, and none of that makes me want to go shoot up a Walmart. None of that makes me want to pick up a gun and murder someone. When people don't have this is a legitimate excuse too. When people don't have a proper family system in place, they're not raised with the right love and compassion that every human being deserves and should have, bad things can happen. Most of the time when you have serial killers, it's because of that. Not every time, but most of the time. And we live in a society that wants to glorify shooters, puts their names out there, puts their freaking manifesto out there. And I understand, I'll get into that in a minute, but we have a country that makes these people famous. Why do you think they kill themselves? Because they know they can just go out in a blaze of glory. Most of the time they do. We surprisingly got someone that didn't kill themselves. Sorry, my computer went off. But it's almost as if we can't understand why. It's amazing who a country who this happens the most in talks about, I don't know how this could happen. I don't know. There's just no solutions. There's nothing we could do. Really? There's nothing we could do? Oh, wait, yeah, we should look at video games and have some investigation and legislation on video games. Despite the fact that this man was a white supremacist and an awful human, one of the men anyway, is a white supremacist, an awful human being, let's just not even address that. Let's blame video games. Let's not look at the fact that we have not only a system that has a media that glorifies these murdering psychopaths, we also have a country that rather than have a proper discussion about mental health, we want to just throw pills down someone's throat. I'm not discrediting antidepressants at all. I'm not saying that all medicine is bad, but we consistently find ways to not help people with these problems. We don't have an honest conversation about people with anxiety or depression or some sort of other mental health problem. We don't have those honest conversations. Instead, we label it as one thing, we blame it on something else, and we just find some other scapegoat. Whatever helps the narrative, we find that. It's not just a gun problem. I think guns play a factor, but I'm not anti-gun. I don't think it's the gun's faults. They're not the one pulling the trigger. Sure. But it's also a situation with, why don't we have stricter regulation? And that first thing people say that are all about the Second Amendment and people that have guns are, well, they're going to take our guns away. They're going to make it harder and this, that, and the other thing. No, they're not. We have more guns than people. Your guns aren't going anywhere. We're just trying to make sure that people that shouldn't have a gun don't get a gun. And yeah, well, you know, they're going to get a gun anyway. Criminals get guns anyway. But yeah, but wouldn't you make it to be easier to track said firearm? No, we're not, because we're going to have the same scenario and the same discussion we have every freaking shooting. It's going to be the same thing, rinse and repeat. I just don't know what to do. There's nothing to do. We can't do anything. And then another 30 people die. And then another 50 people die. Another 100 people die. And then maybe, just maybe, at the grace of God, we'll just murder everybody and we'll be freaking dead. That would be the day when we all just decide to just finally end it and bomb ourselves into oblivion. Then maybe we can say something got done. Nothing will get done. Children will be murdered. Mothers will be murdered. Pregnant women will be murdered. Nobody cares because the NRA has got its hands so far in politicians' pockets, there's no way that any legislation will get passed. None. And instead of actually doing something about it, we'll blame it on something else. We'll blame it on video games. We'll blame it on movies. We'll blame it on books. We'll blame it on Islam. We'll blame it on white supremacy. Instead of looking at the situation and understanding that something has to be done. I'm sick and tired of scapegoats. I'm sick and tired of people doing nothing. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make that decision at the ballot box. I'm going to show my anger in November of 2020 when I'm making my votes. Because that's the only way that we could possibly have that change. I say this a lot. Whenever these kind of things come up, I always think of the song by Buffalo Springfield. For what it's worth. There's a line in that song that just always comes to mind, especially in this situation. It simply just says, nobody's right if everybody's wrong. And that is why nothing gets fixed when it comes to this. Because nobody wants to take responsibility for anything that happens that could play a factor into this stuff. And nobody wants to admit, hey, don't you think we have too many gun lobbyists? Don't you think our president goes way too far in the things that he says when he says it's an invasion? They're invaders. They're not bringing their breasts. They're bringing the rapists. They're bringing murderers. They're people from shithole countries. Don't you think that kind of narrative stokes the flames a little bit? Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying Trump himself is responsible because, again, I believe people have free will and they have their own actions. But I do think we need to understand, especially with our president, who also, by the way, just had a rally that had to deal with talking about an immigrant congresswoman chanting, "Send her back." We got to stop and think about that. And think about how that kind of vitriol can fuel something bad. We've got to be smarter. We have to be smarter. We have to be better because I don't want to have to come back on this podcast. I don't even know if I will because this is how fired up I get about it. But in another couple months, I'll have to come back on here and talk about another giant death toll because nobody did anything. We cannot let this be normal. This is not normal. The minute we start normalizing shootings that happen way too much in this country, the minute we start normalizing that, we are all doomed. Because that is the minute where we've all given up on ourselves. And that's not something we need to do. We have to be smarter. We have to be better. And at the end of the day, whether I like this, I might not like it. You might not like it. You might not even like me. But we're all in this together. So we can't say things to each other and be horrible to each other. Because at the end of the day, that's all we have.